So, hello and welcome everyone to the second keynote talk at the 2021 Leuven Kant Conference. I'm very happy to introduce Brandon C. Look, who is the University Research Professor and Department Chair at the University of Kentucky. As you will no doubt know, his research is focused on the history of modern philosophy, especially on the metaphysics, epistemology, and natural philosophy of Spinoza, Leibniz, and Kant. Alongside his many articles on these topics, he has edited and co-edited and translated the Leibniz-de Bos correspondence with Donald Rutherford and edited the Continuum Companion to Leibniz. He is author of the book Leibniz and the Vinculum Substantiali from 1999. He's currently engaged in a larger project that examines Kant's engagement with Leibniz and the Leibnizian tradition. So part of this is an edited volume which is forthcoming this summer with Oxford University Press, Leibniz and Kant. And he is currently working on a monograph which I believe is going to or proposed to be titled Leibniz, Kant and the Possibility of Metaphysics. So you'll be familiar with the format. We plan to have a talk from Brandon Look for around 40 minutes, and then a brief response and a Q&A. Please keep yourselves muted until you're invited to speak during the Q&A, and use the raise hand function to signal you have a question then. I will also introduce now our respondent, Arnaud Pelletier, who, as well as being a long-term co-organizer of the Leuven Kant Conference, is professor in the history of modern philosophy at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And his research, on which he has published very widely, focuses on Leibniz and Kant, and also on figures like Wolff and Thomasius. Among his edited books is, I'll mention one, Christian Wolff's German Logic, Sources, Significance and Reception. And he's also translated into French Kant's inaugural dissertation, The Metaphysical Foundations, and the Philosophical Encyclopedia. So I'm now happy to give the virtual floor to Brandon Look. His talk is titled Leibniz, Kant, and the Supreme Principles of Reason.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And thank you, Karin, and your team for organizing this really wonderful conference, video or virtual conference. I'm really happy to take part in it. As I said earlier, it would be wonderful if we could all be together, but that's not the way things worked out. Clearly, this is not the best of all possible worlds. I am going to try to share my screen here. It worked a second ago. There we go. All right, so as Steve said, this is part of a larger project on the relation between Leibniz and Kant, or better said, trying to understand Kant's Auseinandersetzung with Leibniz and the Leibnizian tradition. And in one sense, this paper, or the ideas related to this paper, come from a puzzle that I had when working on Leibniz's critique, or Kant's critique of Leibniz, in the Untitled chapter of the critique. And what exactly that puzzle was, I'll try to make clear a little bit later. Okay, now it's not letting me go forward. Let's do it this way. Okay, all right. There are, for me, some guiding questions for this talk, for this paper. The first of which is, how did Kant understand the principle of sufficient reason, and how did he understand Leibniz's use of the principle of sufficient reason? And I should probably add, how did Leibniz understand the principle of sufficient reason? Because that in itself is not exactly clear and not exactly settled, I think. Also, a guiding question for this talk is, what is the relation between the principle of sufficient reason as expressed by Leibniz and the supreme principle of reason as expressed by Kant? Now, kind of to set the stage, I just want to refer to one of my favorite passages on the principle of sufficient reason. This comes from Schopenhauer. And if you don't know Schopenhauer's The Fourfold Root, you should. It's a wonderful work. But he has this to say about Leibniz. Oh, and I should also say, years ago, I bought a little volume in Germany called Philosophen beschimpfen Philosophen. So philosophers curse out philosophers. And about 40% of it was quotes from Schopenhauer, 40% of it was quotes from Nietzsche, and then all other philosophers constituted the remaining part of the volume. In any case, here's what Schopenhauer has to say about Leibniz. Leibniz first put forth the principle of reason formally as a fundamental principle of all cognition and science. He proclaimed it very pompously in many passages in his works, thereby even putting on airs about it and portraying himself as if he were the first one to discover it. However, he knew nothing further to say about it, except that anything and everything must always have a sufficient reason why it is so and not otherwise, which must have been quite well known to him, quite well known to the world before him. In doing so, he occasionally indicated the distinction between the two fundamental meanings of the principle, but did not expressly emphasize it, nor even clearly discuss it elsewhere. Now, I think there's something right about this, but let's talk about something else. What are the two fundamental meanings of the principle of sufficient reason, or the Satz vom Grund, according to Schopenhauer? First of all, there's a cognitive Grund, what he calls Erkenntnisgrund, and there's the natural cause, an Ursache. Now, Schopenhauer is right that Leibniz does not sufficiently disambiguate these two meanings of the principle of sufficient reason, and he's also right that the two senses are there, and maybe some other senses of the PSR as well. So now let's turn to Leibniz himself and his works. Now, and I'll do this pretty quickly, just for the interest of time, because a lot of this I think you know, or at least the main things you know. So one of the canonical statements of the principle of sufficient reason comes from the Monadology, and I say also canonical because this is a text that clearly Kant knew, and the tradition of 18th century German philosophers knew this text. So Leibniz says in the Monadology, our reasonings are based on two great principles, that of contradiction, in virtue of which we judge that which involves a contradiction to be false, and that which is opposed or contradictory to be false, to the false to be true, and that of sufficient reason, by virtue of which we consider that we can find no true or existent fact, no true assertion, without there being a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise, although most of the time these reasons cannot be known to us. The second canonical statement, again, something known to the entire 18th century German philosophical tradition or European tradition from the Theodicy. There are two great principles of our reasoning. The one is the principle of contradiction, stating that of two contradictory propositions, the one is true, the other false. The other principle is that of a determinate reason. It states that nothing ever comes to pass without there being a cause, or at least a reason determining it, that is something to give us an a priori reason why it is existent rather than non-existent, and in this wise rather than in another. But there's also kind of a not so canonical statement, I would say, and this is from a small text that was unknown to Kant and unknown to 18th century philosophers, first published by Couturat in 1900, more or less. The fundamental principle of reasoning is that there is nothing without a reason, or to explain the matter more distinctly, that there is no truth for which a reason does not subsist. So far, so good, but now we get the important and very Leibnizian thing. The reason for a truth consists in the connection of the predicate with the subject. That is, that the predicate is in the subject. All right, now see, keep that in mind because it's going to kind of give a lie to one of the things that Kant is going to say about Leibniz, or at least the way he wants to interpret Leibniz in a favorable light. And kind of finally, for my purposes, kind of in terms of background, the account that Leibniz gives of reason, or a reason, in the Nouveaux Essais, which again will be something that Kant knew. A reason is a known truth whose connection with some less well-known truth leads us to give our assent to the latter. But it's called a reason, especially and par excellence, if it is the cause not only of our judgment, but also of the truth itself, which makes it what is known an a priori reason. A cause in the realm of things corresponds to a reason in the realm of truths, which is why causes themselves, and especially final ones, are often called reasons. And lastly, the faculty which is aware of this connection amongst truths, i.e. the faculty of reasoning, is also called reason, and is in that sense that you are using the word. Now, this whole point about the status of reason as a faculty will come to bear towards the end of this talk. Now, what we've got here is, again, kind of what Schopenhauer was saying. Leibniz is kind of all over the map here. He's not being really clear about what the principle of sufficient reason is. Again, I'll say this at the end, but part of the reason is he thinks it's so obvious, and yet there are things that we need to disambiguate. So the main fundamental formula, as it were, nihil est sine ratione, I will turn on its head just a little bit, and instead of making it a negative assertion, I'll make it an affirmative assertion. There's a reason for everything. But we can interpret this in a bunch of different ways. And I'll just say a general way. I'm not doing this in a completely logic chopping kind of way, a little more, colloquially, but for philosophy talk, colloquially. For all things, whatever they may be, there's a reason why it exists rather than does not exist, or rather why it is so and not otherwise. Now, there's also a sense very clear in Leibniz where there's kind of the universal causal maxim, or the universal causal principle. For all events, there is a reason why it comes to pass, or why it happens. That is, for every event, there is a cause. And there's probably a cause why the indentation there was not preserved in the way I formatted it originally. There's also, let's say, a logical understanding of the principle of sufficient reason, dealing with propositions or truths. So for all true propositions, there's a reason why it's true. That is a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Now, we know, of course, that the principle of sufficient reason was tremendously important for Leibniz. And as he says in a text that Kant didn't know, but this will serve for our purposes anyhow, the axiom that there's nothing without a reason must be considered one of the greatest and most fruitful of all human knowledge, for upon it is built a great part of metaphysics, physics, and moral science. Without it, indeed, the existence of God cannot be proved from his creatures, nor can any argument be carried from causes to effects, or from effects to causes, nor any conclusions be drawn in civil matters. So standard stuff that we should know. Same kind of thing in the letter of Clarke, that by this single principle, we get to know the existence of God and so on. So I'll skip that, I won't read that any further. We look at the text, which is in English generally called the Primary Truths. After Leibniz gets to the principle of sufficient reason, he says that a whole bunch of things follow from this. Actually, a whole bunch of things follow from the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of contradiction and his predicate in notion account of truth. What follows from these things? What follows from the principle of sufficient reason? The principle of the identity of indiscernibles, the complete concept theory of substance, his mirroring thesis, the denial of causal interaction, the forerunner of pre-established harmony, the denial of vacuum, the rejection of atoms, and the thesis of simple substances. And all of that stuff stays constant throughout his thinking, of course. In the correspondence with Clarke, we get his assertion as well, of course, that we have no reason to believe in absolute space and time because of the principle of sufficient reason. And you all know this, right? There's no reason why God should have created the universe with, a central point here as opposed to here, and therefore there can't be absolute space. Take that argument for as strong as you wish, but it's important for him. Actually, for the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but what Leibniz is doing here in this text, The Resume of Metaphysics, is actually giving a slightly different kind of argument for why God must exist as the real cause that grounds all other things. But for the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. Now, what I want to do is, in order to get to Kant's account of the principle of sufficient reason and Kant's account of the supreme principle of reason, I want to make a segue through the Amphibole chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason and get to what for me was something puzzling, but like lots of puzzles, once you realize the solution, you kind of think, why was I so stupid? Now, again, this is something that I assume you know, and I'll try to go through this quickly. But of course, in the Amphibole chapter, or the Amphibole section of the critique, Kant accuses Leibniz of making a fundamental error in failing to distinguish between sensibility and understanding. And I won't go through all of this, but just really quickly, let me read the beginning parts of this. Lacking such a transcendental topic and thus deceived by the amphibole of concepts of reflection, the famous Leibniz constructed an intellectual system of the world, or rather believed himself able to cognize the inner constitution of things by comparing all objects only with the understanding and the abstract formal concepts of its thinking. And now here's what I want to emphasize in this quote. Our table of the concepts of reflection gives us the unexpected advantage of laying before our eyes that which is distinctive in his theory in all its parts, and the leading ground of this peculiar way of thinking, which rests on nothing but a misunderstanding. He goes on a little bit to talk about, again, this not treating sensibility as being fundamental, and so on. And then kind of the conclusion, or at least the conclusion for what I want to use here. In a word, Leibniz intellectualized the appearances instead of seeking two entirely different sources of representation in the understanding and the sensibility, which could judge about things with objective validity only in conjunction. Each of these great men, Leibniz and Locke, holds only to one of them, which in his opinion does nothing but confuse or order the representations of the first. So, the thing I want to highlight is this. When we look at the peculiar or the fundamental thesis of Leibniz's system, as derived from the table of judgments, or as derived from the concepts of reflection, we get obviously four, because it's the table, right? Four things that are supposed to be unique to Leibniz. So first of all, identity and difference. And so Kant talks about the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, agreement and opposition, the claim that there's no real opposition, that is Leibniz's optimism. The inner and the outer, so that leads us to the monadology. I've written about this elsewhere. It's a really cool argument. And matter and form, dealing with relationalism with respect to space and time. But now, if you compare what Kant says about Leibniz in other works, right? He lays out some fundamental theses of Leibniz's system. And the first one he always keys on is the Satz vom zureichenden Grund, principle of sufficient reason, pre-established harmony, the monadology, and the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, although only in welche Fortschritte, right? And so this led me to wonder for a long time. So this is my puzzle. Why doesn't Kant include the principle of sufficient reason in his criticism in the Untitled Chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason? He said, after all, that his table of the concepts of reflection, or his account of the concepts of reflection, or better, Leibniz's failure to distinguish sensibility from the understanding, led to 4 unique and peculiar aspects of his philosophy. But he doesn't include the principle of sufficient reason in that list. And that always struck me as odd. And so I had this theory, this idea, which now I think is totally wrong, that he didn't include the principle of sufficient reason and he didn't include pre-established harmony because he had a different account of causality from Leibniz. And so that was something lurking in the background that Kant didn't want to key in on because it was going to come out later in the practical philosophy as well as in later parts of the Critique of Pure Reason itself. But now I've realized that the answer is in fact a lot simpler. And maybe you all knew this and it wasn't a puzzle for you at all. And this is why I said lots of times you have this puzzle and once you realize what the answer is, you kind of think of how stupid you were. The answer is that the illegitimate use of the principle of sufficient reason follows from a failure to understand the distinction between the faculties of understanding and reason. All right. And so now I go through what Kant says here about the faculty of reason. And again, I think I have a little bit too much text here. So for the interest of time, I'll kind of skim a fair bit. But let me read the first thing, which again, I assume you know, but where he says, look, our cognition starts from the senses, goes there to the understanding, and there ends with reason, beyond which there is nothing higher to be found in us to work on the matter of intuition and bring it under the highest unity of thinking. And this whole idea of unity of thinking will be important. He also says, of course, that the faculty of reason is the faculty of principles. Faculty of understanding was, of course, the faculty of rules. He distinguishes between the logical and real use of reason. Again, this is stuff I assume that all of you as Kantians know and know well. He also says, though, in the beginning parts of the dialectic, that everything that happens has a cause cannot at all be inferred from the concept of what happens in general. Rather, it is this principle that shows how one can first get a determinate experiential concept of what happens. And in one sense, insofar as the principle of sufficient reason could have been interpreted in terms of the universal causal thesis, this is here being presented as the universal causal thesis. What he's saying is that this is not a principle of reason. It doesn't really lie in the realm of reason. And as we also know, this was part and parcel of one of the pure concepts of the understanding that makes experience possible in general. Again, something that I assume you all know quite well. All right, let me go through this, though. This is one little important thing that I want to get out. Kant goes on to write, if pure reason also deals with objects, yet it has no immediate reference to them and their intuition, but deals only with the understanding and its judgments, which apply directly to the senses and their intuition in order to determine their object. Sorry, I think I read that badly, but I'm going to go on. The unity of reason is therefore not the unity of a possible experience, but is essentially different from that, which is the unity of understanding. That everything which happens must have a cause is not a principle cognized and prescribed through reason at all. Okay, so again, the principle of sufficient reason as entailing a universal causal thesis doesn't have to do with a principle of reason at all. I think I'm going to skip this just to go on to something else a little more important. This is where he sets out the logical use dealing with the universal conditions of judgment, but this is going to come out in a moment better and more clearly, I think. But now we're going to get to something that's crucial here. The logical maxim, this logical maxim, cannot become a principle of pure reason unless we assume that when the condition is given, the conditioned is given, then so is the whole series of conditions subordinated one to the other, which is itself unconditioned, also given. All right. The principles arising from the supreme principle of reason will, however, be transcendent in respect of all appearances. That is, no adequate empirical use can ever be made of that principle. It will therefore be entirely distinct from all the principles of the understanding, whose use is completely immanent, and so on. Okay, and then the last quote here for this point is basically the supreme principle of reason. Reason demands this in accordance with the principle, if the conditioned is given, then the whole sum of conditions, and hence the absolute unconditioned, is also given, through which alone the conditioned was possible. And he goes on to say, look, the entire antinomy of pure reason rests upon this dialectical argument, which is basic, and then he basically reasserts this. So the supreme principle of reason, according to Kant, is if the conditioned is given, then the whole sum of conditions, and hence the absolute unconditioned, is also given, through which alone the condition was possible. So again, we can express this, and here I'm purely following Marcus Vilicek's account in the book, The Sources of Metaphysics, or Kant and the Sources of Metaphysics. For all x, if x is conditioned, there exists the totality of conditions of x, which is itself unconditioned. And I don't know if Arnaud will pick up on this and talk about this, but this is where I need to do a lot more work in my entire talk, in the entire account of here, because a lot is going to hang on the idea of the totality of conditions. And I hope to make that clear towards the end. So the supreme principle of reason, in some sense, though, replaces the principle of sufficient reason. Part of the problem, though, with the principle of sufficient reason, as Leibniz and his followers presented it, though, was that its scope is too broad. It's used in illegitimate ways. And again, to see this, what I want to do is look at a different text, which is now Über eine Entdeckung, right? His polemical fight with Eberhard, right? Where he says that the critique of pure reason is the true apology for Leibniz. There he says, the principle of sufficient reason itself, in the unlimited universality in which it there stands, is, if it is to be valid of things, obviously false. And let me just take a time out. I think often, or I think I, for a long time, kind of just stuck here and said, okay, well, Kant thinks the PSR is false, end of story. And it's a lot more complicated than that. Actually, Kant thinks that the PSR is, in some important sense, tweaked and twiddled in certain ways, actually very important and right on, but in a particular way, which I'll get at in a second. So it's obviously false. For according to it, there would be absolutely nothing unconditioned, but to seek to avoid this embarrassing consequence by saying of the Supreme Being that it does indeed also have ground of its existence, but that this lies within it, leads to a contradiction. For the ground of the existence of a thing as real ground must always be distinguished from this thing, and this must then necessarily be thought as dependent upon another. So it's clearly wrong the way it's being used. And now he says, and I won't read all of this, but it's a really great point by Kant, or a really interesting point by Kant, where he begins, I'll just say the beginning, is it really credible that Leibniz wished to have his principle of sufficient reason construed objectively as a natural law when he attributed great importance to it as an addition to previous philosophy? Basically, no, that's not what he meant. What he means to say, and I'll pick up in the middle, by the principle of contradiction can be known only what already lies in the concept of the object. If something more is to be said of it, that is of the object, then something else must be added beyond this concept. And to show how this is possible, we have to look for a special principle distinct from that of contradiction. It will have, that is, it will have to have its special ground. Since the latter kind of propositions are now, at least thanks to me, Kant, called synthetic, Leibniz wanted to say only that beyond the principle of contradiction, still another principle, namely that of synthetic judgments, must be added. So what Leibniz was really doing was something like me, Kant, saying, in addition to the principle of sufficient reason, there has to be another principle that accounts for all synthetic truths, where synthetic truths or synthetic propositions are those in which the predicate is not contained in the concept of the subject. Okay. Sorry, there's the German if you're interested. Now, Kant's right. There are times when Leibniz suggests exactly this. So here's something that Kant never would have known, a small text published, I think, first by the Academy editors in the last 20, 30 years. No, it's got to be more available longer than that, but Kant certainly didn't know this, but this is still a good insight into what Leibniz was thinking. Two ways remain for us to know contingent truths, one through experience and the other through reason. By experience, when we perceive a thing sufficiently distinctly through the senses, and by reason, when something is known from the general principle that nothing is without a reason, or that there is always some reason why the predicate is in the subject. And also in the Discourse on Metaphysics, again, not something that, that Kant would have known, but something that all Leibnizian scholars for the last 150 years know. This claim, all contingent propositions have reasons to be one way rather than another. On the other hand, necessary truths are based on the principle of contradiction and on the possibility or impossibility of essences themselves without regard to the free will of God or his creatures. So it seems like Kant is actually kind of right, even though it's, well, self-aggrandizing or being overly charitable if your goal is to make all right-thinking philosophers be more like you. It's right of Kant to say that of Leibniz. On the other hand, I won't read this, but in the Primary Truths, I hinted at this at the beginning. Leibniz presents the principle of sufficient reason as if it followed from the principle of contradiction and the predicate in notion account of truth. And as many of you know, I'm sure all of you, if you read an essay that I wrote on this topic, you know, there's a garden industry of or for 18th century German philosophers of proving the principle of sufficient reason from the principle of contradiction. And Kant and Schopenhauer also will say, this is absolutely stupid. Leibniz played with this idea, it seems. And insofar as the principle of sufficient reason seems to follow from the principle of contradiction, it can't clearly can't be on the same footing as the principle of contradiction. However, it does seem like in the majority of texts, Leibniz does present it as on a par with the principle of contradiction. And so I think Kant's general point does hold. Okay, I hate it when I do that. I'm sure all of you have done this as well. You kind of extemporize the next slide in your presentation. So that's basically what I want to say. So finally, question, or not finally, but 2/3 of the way through, although more than that. Question, if the standard use of the principle of sufficient reason is illegitimate, and if the supreme principle of reason is in some sense its replacement, what is a legitimate use of the supreme principle, if there is one at all? And the answer, again, kind of obvious, especially for Kantians. The principle of reason is a regulative principle. And now, for the interest of time, I'm not going to read this. This is stuff that you know, but basically he says just that this. The principle of reason is a rule. It's prescribing what something's it's going to anticipate our experiences, and so on. I won't go through that. But now kind of the final point before I give my summary, I want to suggest actually that while Kant and Schopenhauer are right in their critiques of Leibniz, and Kant can be construed as being correct in his charitable reading of Leibniz. I think there's also a way for a Leibnizian to kind of say, thanks for your magnanimity. Thanks for wanting to be charitable towards me. I actually think something else is going on. So what Wolff says actually is going to set this up. In his Theodicy, Leibniz explains reason as a chain of truths. I, Wolff, should prefer to say a connection of truths, a Zusammenhang. But I also don't want to call the connection of truths reason, rather the insight that we have into them, because I think one would otherwise deviate from the standard way of talking, for one treats reason as a faculty of the soul, and one should leave it that way. But now look at what the editor to the German translation of the Theodicy said, and the editor is Gottsched, but I think there's something correctly Leibnizian about this that's different, slightly different from what Wolff says, and that will, I think, give the Leibnizian a little wiggle room. So the editor, Gottsched, says, reason, he's basically saying, what does reason even mean? Reason means at times nothing other than the understanding. So reason just is the understanding. I won't go through the examples. Other times, reason means understanding and will taken together. When we say, for example, that the essence of the human soul consists in reason, that's the understanding and the will. Usually, however, the word reason simply refers to the third activity of the understanding, namely the power to infer, to the power to connect and combine truths with each other, or even more in the exercise of this power and the insight into the connection of truths. This is what Kant will call the logical use of reason, of course. All right, so I need to work on that a little bit more, but here are some conclusions, and I think I'm going to be perfectly on time, so I'm happy with myself. So as I said, Schopenhauer is right that Leibniz did not explain as clearly as possible the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz didn't do so, though, because he thought the axiom nihil est sine ratione was obviously true. And yet, as I suggested, there are all these different little ways of pulling out different strands of the principle of sufficient reason. And for someone who is otherwise as careful a thinker as Leibniz, you would have imagined that he would have done this a little more carefully, but he didn't. Kant's also right, probably, that Leibniz is guilty of illegitimately employing the principle of sufficient reasoning, extending its scope beyond what is justified by the critique of pure reason or the critique of your reason. I mean, I'm the last person who will want to allow or countenance a cosmological argument for the existence of God. And I think Kant is right about all of that. And yet, I think a Leibnizian response is possible if one calls into question Kant's very distinction between the understanding and reasoning and reason, as well as the idea that reason essentially seeks a totality for a system of thought. That's something that's not explicit in Leibniz. It's not totally clear. There's a way of deriving the nexus, the Zusammenhang of all truths, according to Leibniz, that's there, but that requires more work. And so just as I've argued in the past, the distinction between sensibility and understanding is something that Kantians take almost as an article of faith, and which, if you look in Kant, you don't really see a good argument for that. I would say, on behalf of Leibniz, you don't always see a good argument for a real good reason to distinguish understanding and reason. You had an entire tradition up until Kant, I'm exaggerating a little bit, of treating reason as just one way in which the understanding, one way in which the mind works. Again, the logical use of reason. And the final thing, Kant's supreme principle of reason might then seem more expansive than Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. fine, it's also doing all of this work. Kant says, look, it's just a regulative principle. It's not making clear claims about the way the world must be. Still, we have to employ it when we're engaged in doing science and so on. That's something that I don't talk about. There's a brilliant article that just came out by Whopping Lou Adler, who talks about this very well, and I would commend that to you. But for the interest of time, I'm going to stop now. So, thanks. And can I just say, I think all the speakers who've gone so far, who've used PowerPoint, know this experience. This is like even worse than teaching a Zoom class where half of your class are little black boxes. So if you're just speaking to your own PowerPoint slide and like expecting to see some smiles or confused looks or rolling of eyes or people shooting their heads, that was not a fun experience. But what we don't do for the Wissenschaft. Okay.
You're a windowless monad for a moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but we're all here and we're back. So I think we now turn to Arnaud Pelletier for a brief response.
Yes, thank you, Brandon, for this great talk. I will not give a response. I will just, if you want, share a few reactions and a few questions I got when reading your PowerPoint before. So the point is, Leibniz is guilty. Is guilty because the PSR is too broad, and thus there are illegitimate uses of a PSR. And my first reaction is that the inference from the first proposition that the PSR is too broad does not entail the second part, that there are illegitimate uses for Leibniz. So, and you start with this nice quote, and you start and finish with this nice quote from Schopenhauer, where he says, well, everything is ambiguous. And I think Leibniz is not that ambiguous, because it seems to me it always embraces everything exactly in this PSR. So exactly cognitive ground and natural causes are always mentioned. So, and you've quoted this, the three meanings of reason for Leibniz in this chapter of the new essays, and where it says, well, first of all, reason is a reason for truth, and then there is the cause which corresponds to truth, and then, and I would say only on the second step there is a faculty which perceives or reflect on this connection. And I think that a lot of things are going on, and you said this, because primarily reason means for Leibniz Grund, the ground of the thing and the ground of a truth, and not the faculty, not the Vernunft reflecting on it, and that changed everything. So I think you were really right in quoting Wolff and Gottsched. But then the question is about this different distinction between legitimate use and illegitimate use of the PSR. It is why would it be illegitimate? Illegitimate because it is applied to non-empirical objects, but with a pretension to gain a full knowledge. So, and these are two different propositions to me. It is absolutely clear that for Leibniz, it applies to everything, so to speak, so to every object. But it does not mean that by the use of a PSR, you always lead or yield the same kind of knowledge. So Leibniz will never say that when you use the PSR for having a notion of God or metaphysical demonstration of God, or when you use the PSR in an empirical context, you gain exactly the same modes, the same notions of the same modes of knowledge. So he won't go to say that because it applies to all our notions, it means that all our notions are homogeneous, or that it does not distinguish between cognitive faculties. For instance, that it does not distinguish between sensibility and understanding. The one does not imply the second, it seems to me. I hope I'm clear with this point. There is a second point, but you did not address it. That was the point on primary truths. It's some stuff for Leibnizian. So whether there is only PSR or principle of contradiction, or one can be derived from the other, and so, okay. And you can find, that's true, text which apparently are really ambiguous on that. Yeah, that's true. So what does it mean when say that the PSR follows from? Does it really mean that he's logically independent or not? So I leave this aside, but the thing is that exactly this, when he addresses the PSR, it does not, I mean Leibniz, it does not address it alone. It's always in connection to the principle of contradiction, or most of the time. And those both principles are only the principles of reason, which are not all the first principles, but there is an even greater set of principles, which he calls first principles. And you've got the first principles of reason, but also the first principles of experience, for sure. And it is also a problem just to single out this principle and say, well, the whole metaphysics rests on this sole principle, when Leibniz himself says, well, there are a bunch of principles of reason and also, guys, principles of experience. So if you throw out half of the principles, well, you have a pretty good rationalist idea of Leibniz. So that was my second perhaps remark. That's not a question, but there was, to speak the truth, I was expecting this, because in your title, you had you mentioned a plural, the principles of reason. That's why I was expecting that you develop something on this many principles of reason. And then going back to the question of a legitimate use of a PSR. So that's the end of your talk, and say, well, for Kant, there is a legitimate use of a PSR. That's the supreme principle of reason, first of all. So that's not the principle of causality, but the supreme principle of reason. And this principle is legitimate as a regulative principle, if I correctly understand you. And my question to you is, actually, is not that what Leibniz exactly says, that the PSR is a regulative principle, and that it is too broad, and that the problem of the ambiguity, perhaps that's a suggestion, that's just to start the discussion, that the ambiguity is that it precisely does not specify how it does apply to the different sciences, which each of them rely on different principles. And it does not say that you have to use all the same principles in all sciences. No, that's for sure. There are well-known examples. You cannot use final causes for the search of phenomena. You cannot use the principle of causality when dealing with mind and body. And so that's obvious for Leibniz that to have this broad meaning of PSR does not mean that you have an homogeneous map of knowledge without differences. So that was my question, actually. Is that not this understanding of PSR as a regulative principle the true apology of Leibniz in the end? That was my suggestion on reading this, and I'm really curious to hear you on this. Thank you, Brandon.
Great, thank you very much, Arnaud. Yeah, Brandon, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I would. Arnaud, you said so many wonderful things there, and thank you very much. Where to begin? So let me start. I always feel conflicted when I mean, this conflict that I've been carrying with me for 15 plus years, trying to work on Leibniz and Kant, which is to say, I don't expect any of you to know my biography, but I come from kind of the Leibnizian background. And I think that Kant gets a whole bunch of things right, but I want to kind of fight for Leibniz. And so I'm always kind of going back and forth in my mind. And I think, you know, no offense to all of you Kantians, but I often have the sense that Leibnizians kind of know that most of what Leibniz said has got to be bonkers and wrong, whereas all Kantians think that Kant got everything right. So that's like the starting point for all thought. Yeah, thank you. So that's why I always want to push back a little bit. So here's where I think that Kant's right in calling Leibniz's use of PSR both too broad and illegitimate. And just think about something which I didn't quote, you know, Leibniz's famous text on the ultimate origination of things, where you get it most clearly. You know, everything in this world has to have been caused by something. You got the universal causal thesis, and then there has to be a cause for that whole series, and that's got to be outside of it. So that's clearly the step where we go into the super sensible, and that's got to be, that's where I completely follow Kant and say, yeah, you can't make that inference just because every little thing in this world seen this way, that there's got to be something for the entire world. And that's where it's both too broad and illegitimate. A lot of the little things, though, I think you're right. And I really love the way you said it at the end, that thinking of the PSR or the supreme principle of reason as a regulative principle is in fact kind of what Leibniz does do often, and he's often not given credit in the way he should be given credit, especially also, as he said, there are all these empirical principles or experiential principles for Leibniz that are crucial. And again, you know, it's kind of like the cliched view of Descartes as being this philosopher who did all of his studies of the natural world by sitting in his armchair and reflecting on the way the world must be without actually doing experiments, which is totally false. And it's also false to think of Leibniz as being this pure rationalist who constructs, as Kant would say, an intellectual system of the world based on pure certain principles of contradiction, reason, and so on, without actually caring about the way we experience the world, because that's not the way Leibniz actually engaged with science and metaphysics. And, you know, Arnaud, you know this, but again, for those not as up on Leibniz, you know, one of the nicest quotes from Leibniz is, you know, I would rather, I don't know, you can correct me if I get this wrong, but the sense of it is, I would rather read one page of Leuvenhoek's observations with his microscope than read 100 pages of some metaphysician yammering about something, right? That's the sense of it. So there's something totally right about that. So there was so much more in what you said, Arnaud, but I kind of lost track. So let's just hope we get back to some of these things in the Q&A.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both very much. This has been a fascinating exchange already. I'm sure Arnaud could reply to the reply, but I think we should open the floor for further questions. So please use the raise hand function. And we have a first question from Sanayi.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. Your talk reminded me of a debate about the immortality of the soul previous to Kant, whether the immortality of the soul can be known from the concept of the soul. It follows necessarily, right, conceptually from the notion of soul, or whether it depends on God's will, right? That God could, the immortality depends on will. That is, it's not an analytic truth, but it's a truth that is necessarily true, but depends on God's volition. So it seems to me that, and obviously it seems that Kant is on the second ground, like Meyer. He thinks that immortality of the soul doesn't follow from the concept of the soul. We need to postulate the existence of God, etc. So why am I talking about this? It seems to me that for Leibniz, the principle of sufficient reason is an analytic principle, and it says that all truths and all truths that are necessarily true are analytic truths and have this kind of connection. And maybe when Kant reads that principle, realizes that, well, maybe we should think about grounds instead. And when we talk about the principle of sufficient ground, then we can distinguish logical grounds the way that Leibniz talked about, right? Everything is logical ground, versus the real grounds, as you pointed out, that that are necessarily still connected. These distinct things are connected, immortality and soul, and yet their necessary connection doesn't depend on this analytic necessity or the truth of the judgments, but there is kind of a necessary connection between two things that exist in the way. So this is a synthetic, in a sense, necessity, but depends on God's volition. So I'm wondering if what Kant criticizes in Leibniz is that he didn't recognize that there could be this real grounding relationship, and the principle of sufficient ground, then his account, can account for both the logical grounding relationships as well as the real grounding relationships that can account for this kind of necessity in the second sense.
Yeah, okay, great. That's a great, that's really helpful and a really great point. So one of the things, I would have to go back and go through all the texts where Leibniz says this just to make sure, but let me just make a bold assertion which can easily be falsified. I'm going to say there were no texts available to Kant from Leibniz in which Leibniz said clearly, all truths are such that the predicate is contained, the concept of the predicate is contained in the concept of the subject. And his distinction between necessary and contingent is then going to be one in which, again, as any of you have spent more than 2 seconds reading Leibniz know, the necessary is one in which you will reach an identity through a finite number of steps, and a contingent statement is one in which there's going to be an infinite analysis possible before you get to identities. And so I want to say that everything that, I mean, in one sense, for Leibniz, if Leibniz were to adopt Kant's way of speaking, everything would be analytic in one sense, in one non-trivial sense. And I don't think Kant saw that. Again, I would have to go back and make sure of that, but I don't think those are really texts that were easily available to him. And he does talk about infinite analysis in some texts that were available, but still that might have been so odd sounding that it would have been off-putting. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, obviously he know about Wolff, and Wolff explains Leibniz very well, and so it could be that he got that idea, and his point is just we need real grounding relationship here.
But I mean, in one sense, so, you know, there was one passage that I read, but I went through it really fast. You know, what's the real ground? In one sense, you know, the real ground is, on the one hand, the individual itself, the created subject, which contains all of its predicates, past, present, and future. Similar kind of thing could be said about a proposition. The real ground is also, of course, God, who was the creator of that world in which all of those contingent truths obtained, right? So the real ground is both God and an individual substance or proposition. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question from Michael Walshos.
Hello. Hi. My question picks up on something that Arnaud Pelletier mentioned. I was curious about the plural of principles in your title too. But so I'm really just curious if you have a take on what happens to the principle of non-contradiction in Kant. If there's an interesting story there.
The short answer is no. I'm sure I could probably
okay.
go on for a little bit thinking of something, but no, I never really thought of that. Do you have, why do you ask? Why does it seem interesting to you?
Well, I mean, I'm interested in it to try and explain the contradictions involved in failing the formula of the universal law, to be honest.
Oh, right.
But I mean, so I take it that it's no longer a fundamental principle in the way that it was for Leibniz. It's at least not one of, you know, two fundamental principles. Surely it's still fundamental. I'm just curious if, you know.
Yeah, again, you know, the short and honest answer is I haven't really thought about that.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I would prefer not to just BS. So
no worries, that's fine. Thanks. All good.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Gunther Züller.
Thank you. And thank you for a very inspiring paper and presentation. I've always been surprised by the fact that Kant's discussion of Leibniz in the first critique takes place in the analytic, towards the very end, but in the analytic and not in the dialectic, where you would expect that a rationalist philosopher and his system is being systematically analyzed and critiqued the way that it's done for any other number of anonymously figuring authors. But then I see that the ultimate intent of the discussion of Leibniz toward the end of the analytic is to retrieve Leibniz for Kant's own project, which he paraphrases or labels later then as doing an apology for Leibniz,
Right.
providing a defense in the form of a rereading, a critically Kantian rereading of Leibniz along those lines. And turning now to the Eberhard text that you mentioned, there is a specific reference there to the principle of sufficient reason that quite explicitly proposes to read the principle of sufficient reason as the principle of synthetic judgments a priori.
Yeah.
The contradiction principle is the analytic supreme principle. The supreme principle of synthetic judgments is the principle of sufficient reason. So that's the attempt made within the analytic, not the dialectic of the first critique, to render acceptable the Leibnizian layout. And that means, of course, that whether he knew it or not, the inessor principle of the predicate and the subject wouldn't hold here. Exactly the opposite point, that it is a synthetic relation and not an analytic one. So it would be a further point of criticism at a procedural level for Leibniz. And the second point I wanted to mention is that I think it's very striking also now in Schopenhauer that he discusses this all under the strange notion fourfold root.
Mm-hmm.
That's a notion that doesn't occur anywhere else in the tradition before. He needs it because he doesn't think that there is a way of unifying down to one single root the four different kinds of versions of principle of sufficient reason. And then he undercuts the very image that Kant uses with the possible common root to sensibility and understanding, just as a way of stressing further the discrepancy here between Schopenhauer and Leibniz.
Yeah,
a very interesting paper. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for your comments. That's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? Just on the latter thing with Schopenhauer, I love that text by Schopenhauer. I love his fourfold root, and you're right. I mean, what he's doing is getting what he says is there are four ways in which things can be appearances to us, and that's why we need four different accounts of a principle of sufficient reason, and that's much more fine-grained than either Leibniz or Kant, a more fine-grained account than either of them attempted. And I think there's something that's right about that. Yeah, your point about Kant's take of the PSR in the Über eine Entdeckung is also really helpful. I think, again, this is just like the first go, this is the first attempt at dealing with these issues. And so there are a whole bunch of things that I know I need to work on a whole lot more. As I told Karin, I was somewhat disheartened because I had this idea of talking about Kant and the principle of sufficient reason and the supreme principle of reason. And I proposed this topic. And then she said, oh, there's this great paper that came out by Huaping Lou Adler. And I read it and I said, as I wrote back to Karen, it's not the first time in my life that someone stole my ideas before I had them, but it's kind of crestfallen. So she did a lot of this work, but there's some more that I need to do. And part of that is exactly in the point that you talk about, namely distinguishing between the supreme principle of reason, as in the beginning of the dialectic, as I presented in the paper, and the supreme principle of synthetic judgments, which is also slightly different, and working that requires a whole lot more work. So I need to do that, but thank you.
The next question is from Pier Paolo Betti.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon, for this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I especially like the link that you made between the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of reason in Kant, especially in the formulation of if a condition is given, also an unconditioned must be given, right? And I want to stress this point, especially by looking at the text on the against Everard on a discovery. Because I think that we can use that formulation of the principle of the supreme principle of reason in relation to the other apology that Kant carries out in that text against Everard, namely the apology of monadology. And precisely there is a passage in which there is a number of passages in which Kant says, well, he discusses simple beings, monads, and he says, of course, the notion of simple is just a negative concept that reason needs because it constitutes the unconditioned that in a way grounds the condition, right? And one may think, well, this is precisely the too broad application of the principle of sufficient reason, but I don't think this is the case because Kant doesn't want to say that by saying that we need this concept of the simple, we fall in the second antinomy, right? In the notion of the simple that Wolff or Baumgarten uses. But in a way, he wants to defend this idea of the simple as that unconditioned, that ground the condition in a sort of regulative sense. And I think that it does this also in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic, where it defends the notion of the soul as simple, not in a rational way, but precisely as this regulative principle, as this sort of unconditioned that again ground the condition. So would you agree with this reading, and how do you see this connection and in this connection between the principle of sufficient reason and the apology of a sort of monadology, if you want?
Yeah, no, thank you again. That's a great point, and you know, I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're totally right. And I think there's also a sense in which, and this is getting back to what Conchazola was getting at, that, you know, I was being a little facetious or sarcastic in talking about how Kant was trying to take Leibniz all onto his side and say, well, if you really understand Leibniz correctly, he'd be like me. But that's not exactly what's going on. What Kant's actually saying, and this is what he comes up in the account of the monadologies, where he says, well, you know, he's created, I think the phrase is a perfect Platonic conception of the world. Actually, that could be in the metaphysical foundations, but still, that's his view. You know, Leibniz gives us a perfect Platonic conception of the world if our cognitive faculties were so constructed in the way that Leibniz believes them to be, then in fact, we would have good reason to think that the world was constituted by monads, which they had certain kind of features, and there was no causal interaction, and so on and so forth. So I think what you're getting at is totally right, that this idea of the monad as being the unconditioned is ultimately kind of right from Kant's point of view, understood as, you know, a flawed epistemology, let's say.
Yes.
With a flawed epistemology, and you get a cool metaphysics that might actually be right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another 5 minutes, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. I will also ask one if there's time, but Karen.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. Thanks, Brandon, for a very interesting talk. So I would like to come back to your earlier remark you made earlier on in the paper on the distinction between the understanding and reason. And so you were suggesting that that according to Kant, Leibniz fails to adequately distinguish the understanding from reason. And I think that's very plausible. But I think moreover that that this criticism on the part of Kant applies to everything he deals with in the transcendental dialectic. And so I'd like to ask you about your puzzle concerning the principle of sufficient reason and Kant's apparent lack of attention to it. What if, according to Kant, the whole transcendental dialectic is based from beginning to end on this failure to adequately distinguish the understanding from reason, and so there isn't a particular spot where he targets the principle of sufficient reason because he does so throughout the transcendental dialectic and explores, as it were, the various mistakes that emerge from this inadequate use. And I think this somehow is supported by his distinction between the search for the unconditioned that he thinks is perfectly rational in a way, and the tendency on the part of the understanding to turn this unconditioned into a quasi-object. Yeah, so that is something that I would attribute to the understanding and not to reason.
Oh, you done?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, no. It seems to me that a lot, if not everything, that's going on in the dialectic relates to the claim that reason seeks a totality, seeks a totality for all conditions and so on. It seeks to fill itself up, so to speak. And that's why reason left unchecked, left uncritiqued, will always lead us to the kinds of claims about the suprasensible that we're not entitled to. I think that's the way to read it. And the principle of sufficient reason, now here's maybe the key thing, and what I should make clearer is the way Kant understands the principle of sufficient reason is like in the supreme principle of reason, where it is always, seeking a totality. But if you just look at the formulations of the principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz, in Wolff, in Baumgarten, and so on, there's never that kind of claim. It's just that for anything, there's a ground for it. There's a reason for it. Not that there has to be not that this has to expand through everything. Now, of course, you could say that's the natural consequence. But I don't think that that's so obviously what's going on with Leibniz. In fact, I think I said this, the way in which all truths are connected requires another step from the mere acceptance of the principle of sufficient reason. Does that make sense? Now, so you said, though, that the understanding is the thing that's playing the role in making the unconditioned into some object for it. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't quite know how to respond to that point.
Okay, maybe we can talk about this later.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, well, yeah, that could be a good moment then to move to the informal discussion. So as usual, as you know from yesterday, we're going to leave the Zoom meeting open, and we will open breakout rooms so people can move freely between those.
But Karen wanted to say something.
Yes, exactly. Before we do that, there's an announcement from Karen.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Yes, so I'd like to take the opportunity to refer to a volume that was edited by Tinka Prunea-Bretonnet, who's also in the audience, and myself, and that came out last week. And it's called The Experiential Turn in 18th Century German Philosophy. And it in a way spans also the period between Leibniz and Kant. So I thought that some of you might be interested in this, and I'll put the link. It was published with Routledge, and I put it in the chat, and I apologize for asking your attention for this advertisement.
Not at all. Okay, so I think before we then move to the informal part of the session, and I encourage you to get a drink, come back and join a breakout room and move between them. We should now thank Brandon Luck for this great talk and discussion.